Well, hello. Welcome to Theologizing Life, where we talk about how what we think about God shapes the lives we live. And normally, this is the point where I say, with Anthony Cottrell and the one and only Matt Tracy. But Matt, sadly, isn't going to be able to join us today. His daughter has probably a cold, some sinus and coughing, and she's not allowed to go to the daycare. And he didn't think, I guess we could have had his daughter join us and host, but it probably would have been a little distracting. So you just have Anthony today. But joining me today is Zach Szmara. Is that how you say it?
However you want to say it works. Yeah. Szmara. Yeah.
How do you and your wife say it?
We act like there's no S. We say Szmara, but it's Polish. It was changed at Ellis Island, actually. If it was really pronounced with Polish, it'd be more of a J sound, so it'd be Szmara, but we never do that. We just make it Zamara, Szmara, and act
Szmara.
like it's somewhat normal. But there's that S there that throws it off. So
Szmara. Well, so my name's Cottrell, but there's some people that say Cottrell. There's some even in my family that say Cottrell. But my wife and I say Cottrell. So that's why I ask, how do you and your wife introduce yourself? So I'm here with Zach Szmara, and Zach is the executive director of Immigrant Connection, and their mission, they say, at the heart of who we are, our mission, vision, and values reflect our desire to extend welcome and love to our immigrant neighbors. So we're going to talk a little bit today about immigration. But first, I always like to ask our guests to tell us a little bit about who they are. So Zach, could you tell us a little bit about your story, your background, and particularly maybe how did that lead you to being the executive director of Immigrant Connection?
Yeah, so ever since I was a little kid, I was raised in a family that attended church all the time and stuff, but not like my parents weren't pastors or missionaries or anything. But ever since I was really small, like 4 or 5 years old, I always wanted to be a missionary. I'm not quite sure, where that came from, but like Jim Elliot and Through Gates of Splendor, like that was my hero. I read that book probably much sooner than a child should have read it about like missionaries being martyred. And so I got degrees in intercultural studies, biblical studies, philosophy, and then I went overseas and I was a missionary in Papua New Guinea, and I taught pastors and church planners. Then I came back and got my master's in intercultural studies, like anthropology and ethics, at Asbury Theological Seminary. And I led short-term trips for a while with an organization. Then we went back overseas as long-term missionaries to Mozambique. That was really, really kind of a dark night of the soul. Some people listening to the podcast have probably gone through those in ministries before. It was everything I wanted to do. I was married to my wife, Lindy. Still am married to my wife, Lindy. And we had a 1-year-old son, Isaac. My wife is a special education. Now she's an administrator. She's over special education for our whole school corporation. Then she was just a special education teacher. So really had like a great purpose and kind of own mission before we went overseas. But in Mozambique, as is the case, I think in a lot of mission fields, like there's a role for one, but not two. And so while I was out like showing the Jesus film and planning churches and training pastors, she was at home with a 1-year-old, like slowly kind of losing like her purpose. Mm-hmm. And we were supposed to be there for a 4-year term. We only made it through 1 year, depression, like off the charts, which again is something that probably you could do a whole podcast on, about how oftentimes we don't talk about this in ministry, especially in missions, that at least one of the people in the couple has really, a lot of difficulties with mental health, and we kind of just sweep it under the rug. But we weren't okay with that. We wanted to come back and get health and healing. But when that happened in 2012, I thought I was done. Like I remember, and this isn't a counseling session, but like I remember telling Lindy, we were like in an argument, and I looked at her and I said, like, I don't really care, because no matter what, for the rest of our life, I always win, because I have given up like all of my life's purpose. And like, as if I wasn't overseas, I just didn't see how. Simultaneously, one of my mentors in life, who's a professor at Asbury Seminary, was like, Zach, I thought you were intelligent. I was like, oh, this is a great conversation to have. And basically he was sharing, he's like, look, 281 million immigrants in the world today. Like 1 in 30 people are migrating. Like, there's currently 51 million immigrants in the United States, 15% of the population. Those are all-time highs. He was basically saying, like, we live in unprecedented times. Like, you always felt off with missionaries because missionaries talk about being called to a place. He said, what if God just called you to people? And what if people are here? Wow. And like, you can have like a thriving marriage, a thriving family. Your wife can have a sense of purpose and calling, and so can you. Like, you're not giving anything up. Like, the reality is like, you can be around cultures and people here. And so by God's just wonderful grace and providence, we were sent in 2012 to close a church. We're part of the Wesleyan denomination, and so you can't really be sent really anywhere, but we were going to start a new church in a college town. I've been an adjunct professor for years, and so it seemed like a good fit. But before then, the district asked us if we would go to this little community, Logansport, Indiana, less than 20,000 people, and it was a declining church. Little did I know, when I lied. I said I'd pray about it. We were going to say no, but they called us on a Thursday and said, you're going to be here on Sunday, right? And we're like, how'd you even get our number? And the district superintendent had given our number. So anyways, we said, we'll give you 2 weeks. And on the second week, a Latino family took us to eat. Logansport has the largest percentage of immigrants out of every city in all of Indiana, except for West Lafayette, where Purdue University is, which has a lot of international students. So I always say they cheated. Like, we're really number one. But so lots and lots of immigrants live here. And so the second week, my last week in Logansport, we went out with this family, and this family loved us. We were in a really tough spot, coming back from the mission field, really broken. Everyone else treated us like projects. This family loved us and welcomed us and cared for us, even though we didn't know each other's languages. And we had lunch together, and we kind of just figured out talking to one another. And we decided that we had found home. And because immigrants welcomed us, like, we stayed. And so we can get into this probably with some other questions, but long story short, when you live in a community with lots of immigrants, you quickly learn that there's a principal need that immigrants have. Like, most churches understand the needs of just most people, which is like, they need housing, and there's a need for food, there's a need for education, transportation, those things. But immigrants have this paramount need above those, which is access to legal services. And so when everyone was asking us, can you help us with this? Or like, we have questions about immigration. My assumption was, in a community that had so many immigrants, we would just say, oh, go here. And then we found that, like, in most communities, there is no here to go. People would either drive all the way to Chicago, go down to Indianapolis, or they would use notarios who are illegally practicing law without a license. Anyways, here's the gist of it, and I'm landing the plane. The Department of Justice, all the way back in 1958, because immigration is complex and because they realized that most immigrants might not have the money for an attorney, in the law books, since 1958, they've allowed non-attorneys that if they got training and experience in immigration law, they would allow non-attorneys to practice immigration law if tied to a nonprofit. So there's been this program around all this time. Churches have seldom taken advantage of it. Other nonprofits have, even Christian nonprofits like World Relief or Lutheran Social Services or Catholic Charities, but churches themselves really hadn't. Well, in 2013, when we learned about it, it was like, well, churches are nonprofits. What if church people got training and experience, and the church itself launched a legal office? So we started the very first Immigrant Connection site in February of 2014, right here in Logansport. I thought I was going to serve, a couple dozen of my friends, including that family that I first went to lunch with. We now are the largest and fastest growing network. I've served over 16,000 immigrant families. I mean, it's been a crazy whirlwind, but it all started because of kind of a failure and a loss in Mozambique, and a reality check of understanding that the world is a changing place, and that coming to a closing church, which, by the way, I've been the pastor of for over 10 years now, and it's a thriving church primarily because of how we serve and reach out to immigrants, and we're a multi-ethnic, multilingual church. So anyways, that's me.
And that's a lot. And it's
interrupt me, by the way, at any time.
Yeah, no, it's so interesting. And there's so many, as you're sharing your story, there's so many questions I have. I guess one, that sense of feeling a call to missions, then you obviously followed that all the way, to studying intercultural studies. But were there times in your upbringing of I don't want to say rebellion or anything like that, but were there ups and downs in your upbringing, or was this like this was true north and you stayed the course all the way through?
Oh yeah, I remember. I joke with people that back in high school, I was really an intelligent person. Like I think I've lost, some of it. You get so focused in one aspect, but I did really well on all of the tests and stuff, and so I had lots of people saying like, "Oh, you'd be wasted if you just decided, to go to a Christian school and be a missionary. Like you should be doing, X number of things. Like you should be an engineer or a doctor. So, and I was always like, nope, this is what I'm doing. Like I didn't even want to be like a missionary doctor. For me, it was like, no, it's just, serving the church overseas, just ministry. And so I never kind of swayed on that. But I also would say that I grew up in Northeast Ohio. I grew up saying all the things that I think most people say about immigrants. If you go to any time, any place, any culture, immigrants are a threat and a burden. So we repeat those kind of things, like they're coming to steal jobs, they're coming to have like free healthcare, like all this stuff that really isn't even true. I think we'll talk about later in the conversation. But it wasn't like I understood at all growing up that the world was at our doorstep. Now the reality is I grew up in the 80s and 90s. The all-time low of immigration was the 70s and 80s. Like we have 4 times more international migrants in 2020 than we had in 1970. So some people listening to their podcast, like I'm 40 years old now, it's like if you're in your 40s and 50s, especially if you're in your 60s, it's like this world didn't exist. And so I think a lot of us did have blinders to the reality that we simply can't have anymore. I often use Blockbuster as an example. There's a generation of us that remember Blockbuster, but because they didn't realize changing times, like there's going to be countless generations that don't realize it. It's like the world is changing and ministry is changing in the context of the United States because of immigration. And if we keep acting like immigration isn't a major variable in our communities, like it's the church, isn't going to be what it's called to be. Data shows that population is declining all around, but even in declining communities, the immigrant population is increasing. So it's not big cities, it's urban, it's rural. I'm a little town that, a third of our population is either an immigrant, first generation, or the child of an immigrant. So anyways, yeah, I was unaware growing up though, for sure.
Yeah. So one of the things you also said that was interesting was when that Latino family that took you out, they didn't treat you like a project. What do you mean? What do you mean by that? What did it feel? How did people treat you like a project when you guys came back from what was probably in people's minds considered a failed mission?
Yeah.
What was that like? And we'll talk more about immigration, but I feel like there's something really interesting there.
Yeah, I think anyone that's gone through tough times and if there are a lot of people who genuinely loved and cared for us. So it wasn't like they didn't, but it was like, can we pray over you, or can we do something? And it was like we no longer were people, I think in some people's eyes, like our like who we were didn't really exist anymore. We weren't just Zach and Lindy. We were these broken people, and we were broken. But we found healing when people just like loved us and were present, and we weren't defined by that. Even though, like, I talk about that period like all the time in my church, like that isn't what defines me. And so, that's what was so different. Lindy, my wife, who went through like, the hardest time, it was her that I still remember. Like we left that restaurant, we were supposed to leave town and never come back. And we were in this little gravel parking lot beside the building. And she said, "We're home." It was like it, and for us, a lot of the trauma, like we were diagnosed, it wasn't post-traumatic. We just had trauma after trauma after trauma. was because of some intercultural dynamics, cross-cultural dynamics. Like it was a male-dominated culture in Mozambique, so Lindy wasn't really treated like there as a person. So you would think that you wouldn't find healing through cross-cultural dynamics as well. Like if anything, I thought we would go back to like a homogeneous kind of like an all-white type thing that like, highly educated, like, one of those that would make us comfortable and right.
Yeah.
But instead it's like we found healing and wholeness and acceptance in the midst of radical diversity and people who were very different than us, but loved us so well and so genuinely. And so, and anyone that's been through it, probably, I mean, you've been like, the people that it's like, you don't even know me. And yet like, I sense that like, I belong, I'm welcomed, like you care. And I think that's a profound thing. And I'm always wondering, I mean, a lot of people, when they say, oh my gosh, like, it's so great that you found an Immigrant Connection. It was like, no, immigrants welcomed me. Like I'm returning the favor. Like I wish I could say that I led. It's like, no, I learned from newcomers, like who welcomed me, how to then respond, with welcome and love to newcomers.
Yeah, that's awesome. One other thing before we move on to the next question, you had a term for for individuals who illegally practice immigration law, and I think you said it pretty fast. Was that a Spanish?
Yeah. So a notario. So think of notary public in the United States. The Spanish equivalent is a notario. So the issue, though, is in Latin America, a notario has legal standing. They're kind of like an attorney. They've gone through legal training. So in Mexico, if you had a legal issue, you would go to a notario and they genuinely are legally able to help you. Well, what happened in the United States is they use that phrase. You can easily get a notary public license. Like every county has hundreds of them, who are able to do a notary stamp. Will you use that to, like, if you ever, like, anyone who's listening, like drive around certain strip malls and you'll see like international money orders, notario, like you'll see that word now and realize they're using that word to kind of trick people to say like, because when a Latin immigrant sees it, it's like, oh, this person can help me. But the reality is they have no immigration law training. And so like, even if you Google like notario fraud, you'll see lots of posters and ways to help educate your community. Because there's two different types I always share with people. There are like, I was a notario, like probably shouldn't say that out loud, but like, there are pastors who like we're not supposed to fill out immigration forms. That's providing legal services. That's giving legal advice. Like, so like you could do that for yourself and that for your family, but you shouldn't be helping others unless you get training. So there are good natured people who say, I never take money. I'm just trying to help. And I would say like, talk to us, like, let us help you get training so you're actually legally able to do that. But there's this whole other group that just kind of prey on the vulnerable. Everyone knows that like vulnerable people, marginalized people, are always preyed on. So if you ask like immigrant friends and neighbors about like some of the notarios that they've dealt with, you'll hear stories of, this person took $10,000 and didn't do anything, or this person took $5,000 and they did the wrong thing. Or sometimes it's like this person took my papers and they're holding them hostage. I don't even have my birth certificate because this person said they needed it and now they won't give it back. And so there's all these stories. And so one of the reasons we exist, we want more immigration attorneys. There's 11,000 immigration attorneys. There's 900 nonprofits like us that do this work. We want both of those to continue to grow because there just isn't enough capacity, which is why notarios exist, is because there's nowhere else to turn. So until we can give every immigrant family access to high quality, like real immigration legal services, we're always going to have this group that is not doing it like correctly and is hurting more than helping. Although, side note is, if you ever go up against them in communities, like most people, it's like they've helped some people. So sometimes you'll get a lot of people to defend them. Like, how dare you? Like, they're trying to fill a need that no one else is. But it's like, we understand, but there's a proper way to fill that need. And this is doing more harm than good. And even if they've helped some people, they probably messed up a lot more people than they've helped. And so, yeah, but the word is notario, kind of think notary public, but just kind of the Spanish word for it.
Oh, really interesting. I had no idea about that. So we've kind of talked about it already, but just to I guess for clarity's sake, you started Immigrant Connection and they provide legal services. Tell me a little bit, just what does that look like? What are those services? Are you helping immigrants come here legally? Are you helping people who have come here illegally try to, legalize their being here? Like what are some of the things you do for someone who probably doesn't know anything about the process?
Yeah, the answer is yes. Yeah. So the reality is immigration law is really complex. There's four main ways to come. There's family-based, employment-based, humanitarian, which is like asylum and refugees, and then the diversity lottery. We'll talk about those later, but primarily family-based petitions is what we do, and humanitarian petitions. And so we work with all kinds of people. The reality is in the immigration system, even if someone is undocumented or unauthorized, that would be like if you're listening to the podcast and like you use the term like illegal, realize, like the legal terms are you're undocumented or unauthorized. And so that just means that someone doesn't have papers. Many times, over 50% of the time, they overstayed something that was lawfully, like they were an international student and they stayed too long or something. But to help anyone like that, you almost always have to have someone with lawful status in the room. So family-based immigration is all about someone that's already a U.S. citizen or already a lawful permanent resident requesting one of their family members, a spouse, a child, if you're a U.S. citizen, even a sibling, to have family reunification or to help someone who might not have status in your family gain status. And so it's a two-step process. The first step kind of deals with you have the right relationship. And so you're filling out forms and having evidence to prove like this marriage exists or this is really the mom of this child. And the second step has to do with, are you eligible? Are you, the legal term is admissible. And so sometimes because of things you've done, like if you enter without inspection, you're not admissible. And so then it's like, is there a waiver available or is there nothing we can do? And so, what we do in our offices is like immigrants come and they have questions and we like listen to their whole story. We ask questions and we see what pathways might be available to them to help. Immigration as well, like other than a U.S. citizen, every other process like needs renewed. So lawful permanent residence as a status maintains, once you're a lawful permanent resident, you are a lawful permanent resident forever. But much like a driver's license, you pass your driver's test, you don't have to take it again, but you always have to renew your card. So we'll have lawful permanent residents come in to have to renew, or you'll have things like temporary protected status or DACA, the Dreamers, who are these temporary ones that every 2 years you have to come back in. And so many times we help people, we talk about either maintaining the stability of lawful status, we help reunite family members, and we help lawful permanent residents take that final step to become naturalized U.S. citizens. And so those are kind of the main things that our offices do. But then, anytime there's a change in the migration, like so there'll be thousands of Afghan refugees that will serve, because what they did with those that were fleeing from Afghanistan was, they gave them what's called humanitarian parole, which means for the first 2 years you're here, you have work authorization and you're able to be here, but you have to do something in that first 2 years to get in another pathway, because after 2 years it expires. And so there's like a pathway for special immigrant visa. If you help the U.S. government, you can get a green card with those forms, or you have to file for asylum and go through that process, or you have to do temporary protected status. But like there's always, Ukraine's another one. It's like, so in the midst of all the things we do, just related to the fact that there are over 50 million immigrants in our country that all usually need some type of service. We're also, with new things that happen, I often tell people, it's like if you're a trail guide and the goal is, to get to the top of the mountain, we're not an advocacy group. We'd love to see more trails to get there, but all we do is we take the law, which is our kind of map, and we help people understand what trails are available to them. And some of them are hard and treacherous and long and costly, but if that's all that exists, we'll go with it. It's like we can't make up our own trails. It's like the law says, here's what it is. And so basically we sit down with people and say like, okay, here's what's available. And the fact of the matter is, because of how outdated our immigration pathways are, there are a lot of people who come in our offices who we simply say, there's nothing we can do. And so in those cases, we become bearers of truth and say, if you can go to the notario and the notario say, oh, give me 10 grand and I'll fix it. And we're like, don't do that. Don't put your family at jeopardy. Like, like if something changes, come back and ask us and we'll tell you, oh, there is something new. And like, let's help you with that. But in some cases, there's nothing we can do. And so in those cases, we just help, the family understand that and prepare and know not to like waste their money or put themselves in any danger. So that's basically what our work is. And so lots of answering questions, filling out forms, writing, legal cover letters and things like that to help immigrants navigate the process.
So I should know this, but could you explain, maybe I should know this, what exactly is a green card and a visa?
Okay.
What are those?
Yeah, so the card that a lawful permanent resident has, and so like we'll just kind of walk through this. If they're data on number of immigrants is always hard. Census data, like random people knocking on your door, like most vulnerable people don't answer to get counted in the census data. I always use the United Nations as a world migration report. And so their data is pretty strong. They use multiple sources. So their last report said that we have about 50 million immigrants. In that data, just so you're aware, anyone that's listening, immigrant and foreign born, those are synonyms. In most data, like in your census, you would look up your foreign born population. They don't say immigrant, they say foreign born. Those are the same things. An immigrant is someone who was born somewhere else, foreign born, and lives here. Out of the 50 million immigrants, 24 million, so almost half, are already naturalized US citizens. This is so important for your listeners. The reality is I think if, like I told everyone to close their eyes and imagine an immigrant, because of the narratives, like you imagine probably someone who's undocumented crossing the border. It's like, that's our narrative. And it's like, no, the average immigrant's already a naturalized US citizen. Then there are about 14 million that are lawful permanent residents. And so a lawful permanent resident has a green card. It's actually called a residency card, but since for years it's always been green in color, we just like use we call it a green card, even though that's nothing official. It's like, so when we talk about, do you have a green card or do you have papers? That means you're a lawfully permanent resident. You're not a citizen yet, but lawful permanent residents, once they are lawful permanent residents for 5 years, 3 years of married to a U.S. citizen, pass the test, they can become citizens. Then in the midst of that, you have about 3 to 4 million temporary lawful people. And so that means they're lawfully here. Like think international students, they're lawfully able to be here, but it's not a permanent thing. It's just for this number of years. Or in that category would be dreamers. They're lawfully here, but their papers only last 2 years and they have to renew them. So there are a lot of those. There are, in that category. And a lot of times people don't realize, in our work, people are like, well, how many people did show up and become citizens? As if you just move from showing up to becoming a citizen. By the way, that is what it used to be. Before 1965, it's like when you arrived 5 years later with no test, with no language to prove language competency, with no fee, you just showed up to any court and you said, I've lived in the United States for 5 years, and they swore you in as a citizen. So like, that's what you're like, if you're listening and you're like, well, my grandparents came the right way. They like, that was the line. You came, you showed up, you were lawful. 5 years later, you said, I want to be a citizen, and you became a citizen. So everything has changed, radically. And then again, so as we're breaking this down, then there's probably around 11 million people who are undocumented or unauthorized. It's hard to get a number, on that. That's kind of the number that most people share. More than half of that 11 million were lawful at one time. So when you hear 11 million, I think, all those people like snuck across the border. It's like, no, many of them came lawfully. And then for whatever reason, sometimes it was because lack of someone to help, they lost their status and now can't get it back. And then you asked the question about a visa. So a visa is like what you need to enter lawfully in any category. So even if you're coming as a tourist, you get a visa to enter the country. If you're coming as an international student, you get a visa. They're different. So that would be a tourist is like a B1, B2. A student is an F1. If you were coming as a family member, it's an L. If you're like an athlete like Giannis, it would be an O. There's all different letters for the visa that lets you come in. And that letter in that category kind of tells you, oh, this visa lets you get a green card, or this visa lets you stay for 6 months and you have to leave. This visa means you can get work authorization. And so they're all kind of different depending on what category you're in.
So, so if I wanted to come into the country, I guess my understanding, at least of the southern border, is there's certain checkpoints that if you go to, I guess, how do I get that visa if I want to come in, that it's not crossing the border illegally, as they say?
Yeah, so there would be a whole process before you went to a port of entry. And so if you're living outside the country, you would get the visa at an embassy or a consulate, an American embassy or consulate in whatever country you're in overseas. So in most cases, like there's all this paperwork filled out, like your family member would fill out all this paperwork in step one. That paperwork right now takes about 12 to 15 months to get approved. Wow. When it's approved, they would transfer it to the Department of State. Right now, there's a lot of consulates that are still closed, but let's say we were in like a post-COVID or a pre-COVID world that wasn't happening. It would be about sometimes 4 months to get an appointment. You would go to the consulate. They would have an interview. They would verify everything. They would make sure you're admissible. And then they would take your passport. It'd be, a foreign passport from your country of origin, and they put a visa in it. And then you'd have a set number of time that you could come either to a land border or fly into the country. And in your passport, you would show them the visa. And so it's this whole process beforehand. There is no just showing up. I mean, for certain tourists, we have agreements with certain countries that you could just show up to get a tourist visa. But anything that you're planning on staying a long time, if you're outside the country, it's this process of you have to go through all the paperwork for your family member, or, it could also be your employer who does all this paperwork to get you access to a visa. Then it's transferred. And the second step is you go through an interview process in your country of origin before you can come in. And here's the reality. They're capped. So 226,000 visas are for families every year. 140,000 are for employees and their families. And so that's why there's this long wait. Ready for this? So if you're a U.S. citizen, you can apply for your children, even if they're over 21. Right now, the wait for a child over 21 who's unmarried is 7 years.
Wow.
But if you're from certain countries, so India, China, the Philippines, and Mexico have their own lines because there's so many people from those countries. So if you're from the Philippines, it's 12 years. If you're from Mexico, it's 21 years.
Wow.
So so you can apply, they can say this is the right relationship, you're eligible for a visa, but there's so many people who have applied for you beforehand that the line gets longer and longer and longer. The longest line right now is if you're the sibling of someone from Mexico. I think they're processing applications that were filed in 1998.
Wow.
So sometimes, once again, it's that we talk often, the line is such a small, it's 2 words. But the reality is when you start diving into this, you realize even when people have a way forward, the reality is it's not as easy as, I think, at least I'll just speak for myself. It's not as easy as I always thought. I thought for sure that people were kind of snubbing their nose at the order of the law and just doing what they wanted to. And then you realize that it's no, this is very, very complex, very, very costly, and very, very time consuming. And even if people try to do it the right way, it isn't just, a few weeks or a few months and everything's, good to go.
Yeah, that's, it's just so interesting. So if like I've been out of the country a couple of times and, I have my passport, if someone were to travel here, let's say someone from Mexico comes here, has a passport and they come to, for vacation, but then they don't hop on the plane to go back, is that one way people come here undocumented, or is it since their passport entering the country, it's like the government knows they're here and they'll realize like, okay, this 2-week vacation turned into a couple months vacation, or like, I guess what I'm saying is what keeps people from doing that? Like,
so what keeps you from doing that? I mean, and they can, but you can't just come from Mexico with your passport. You have to get a tourist visa before, and you have to go through an interview process, and it's hard. So I have a lot of friends who their parents can't come because when they go to the interview, let's say you're retired in Mexico, you want to come visit your family. The officer is listening. What would make them go back? What's anchoring them to Mexico that would make them not overstay? And you don't have a job. It's not like you have school to go to. Like if you don't own property or have a bank account, so when you go to those interviews to get your tourist visa, you're having to prove. And so it's the ones that get them are usually people who say like, look, I'm in college. I'm just going for the summer. Here's my transcript to show like I have classes to come back to, or here's my letter from my job saying like they're employed here. But like if it seems to the consular office, man, this person's going to go and all their family lives in the States, they're just going to stay. They'll deny you a visa. And so I've had more visas are denied at consular interview than are approved, even for tourist visas. And so the countries, there's a number of countries that we're maybe not as fearful of, that the agreement is they can just come in with a passport and get the visa right here. And you're right, those people can decide we're not going back, we're going to overstay. And the reality is there are so many people coming and going that like the system isn't really set up. So if you've ever visited Canada, for instance, sometimes you'll get a stamp in your passport, sometimes you won't. Like it all depends on the Customs and Border Patrol. And so, you can fly in. If you fly in through a plane now, like you're almost always going to be documented. But land borders often, there's just so much happening that they might not have. You maybe flew in, but you drove out, or you drove in and flew out. And so sometimes it's hard to like get all of the information paired together. So it's not as easy. There's been legislation that has been pushed recently that has said like we should track this better to see if there's a way. But there's so many other kind of broken parts of the system that like I don't know if that one will ever really kind of be fixed. So all that to say, it's not as easy to come as I think most people think. But once you are here, like people could choose, to overstay, like even a tourist visa, and try to figure it out. Although, it's difficult to live as an undocumented person in our country. Like there's other countries that, like around the world, that it's a little bit easier to move from undocumented to like lawful. Because every country, that's the other thing that I think confuses some people. You hear news from like Europe or from Australia or New Zealand, and it's like, remember, every country has their own processes. And so just because you hear like, oh my goodness, this happened here, it's like, well, our system is different. And so just because it happens somewhere else doesn't mean it necessarily can or should happen here.
So one of the things that I think I'm just totally surprised by is that I think I assumed that getting a passport must be hard for some people, or they just don't have a passport, because you have to, there is a bit of a process for that. But I didn't realize that you can even have a passport and not, go to Orlando, Florida to see Disney World or something as easily as I've gone to Guatemala or Haiti, or I've been to Spain, been to Canada. Like I didn't realize that you would have to go through that interview process. And that's only from certain countries that were
Yeah, I mean, it's from the majority of countries. It's difficult to visit the United States because remember, your passport is an American passport. So when you come in the country, like when you went to Spain and came back, you went in the American citizens line. But remember, there were those other lines that are
Mm-hmm.
usually longer and slower. That's for if you're carrying a passport from other countries. So any immigrant is obviously carrying a passport from another country. And so it's not as easy to travel. You know, like you can Google and like there's different countries and there's like strong passports and weak passports. Like the strong ones are ones that you don't need a lot of visas for. You can just travel the world and not need, you know, prior permission. Then there's other passports from other countries that it's like almost any place you want to go, they expect you to have a visa to get there.
Yeah,
And
that's
so it's,
interesting.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
I realize like I have American one and coming back to America is simpler, but like I don't remember it being complicated to go to Spain when I visited. My sister-in-law was there for a while as a missionary, and
Well,
like,
this is one of the things, I'm one of the few people who talks about this, but I think this is one of the reasons why the church is a little bit off when it comes to immigration. I think many church people who go on short-term mission trips have thought their whole lives, we've been taught to lie to immigration. I mean, that's the reality. I remember the first time I went to Guatemala, it was like, hey, make sure when you go through the line, just tell them you're here on vacation. Don't tell them we're building anything or don't tell them we're working. You know, like I remember gathering in a
yeah,
group when I went to
yeah,
different places. When the same thing, when I was in Africa, I started working as a tourist before I had my residency, which is illegal. But it was like, it's okay. The ends justify the means. This is what we have to do.
mm,
And so our
mm.
assumption is we grow up as kids in youth group doing that, thinking it must be the same. Like you just say what you need to say to get, and it's like, wait a second. Like, you know, these are laws and we're supposed to follow them, but we kind of have learned as Americans, you know, say what you need to say to kind of get through. Well, when the shoe's on the opposite foot, it doesn't work, you know, like that. And it's a little bit tough. I mean, I remember even going to Canada where people are like, I was preaching at churches and going to be paid for doing that, but they're like, don't say that. Like, and it was like, I had no problem being like, yep, just visiting some friends, you know, like, and it's like, it doesn't, you know, work that way. So sometimes I think we lower like what immigration is like when it's really like, you know, it's some very stringent laws and processes that you can't just kind of cut corners or sidestep, even though we have a tendency to do that ourselves.
Yeah. And that, so as you're sharing all this stuff, there's so much, and we're going to get to this in a second, but there's so much that frustrates me about the injustice of like, particularly sometimes the ways the Christians, American Christians in particular, stereotypically, sorry, I have all these preface remarks. Stereotypically, the way a lot of American Christians talk and the way they politically see this issue, especially in light of what you just shared, is a little bit like, this is going to sound strong, but it's a little bit hypocritical. Like, I mean, it's not a little bit. Like, if you've gone on a mission trip and you've lied to go into a country, or you go to a church that has sent a short-term missions team that you supported and you've done, then you have circumvented another country's laws. While at the same time, that's one of the top reasons I see people being a little bit judgmental of immigrants who come to our country. Well, you know, is it Romans 12 or 13, Romans 13? Is that what they appeal to all the time? You know, obey the law of the land. Anyways, sorry, I get a little, I get a little passionate about justice.
Yeah. And for the listeners, it's like, don't feel like, I mean, in some places you were told that and they were just like looking out for you, but in other places, like really, it was like the things we were doing, we probably should have been on another visa, but, you know, we felt like this was the easiest visa. And like, so, you know, it is a tough, you know, conversation to be had because, yeah, our perspectives are a little bit skewed. I know mine had been because historically it was always like, this is what you need to do, just do it. And so that's not always the right thing.
Yeah.
I hope you don't get a ton of emails from missionaries overseas.
Yeah.
Many are doing exactly what they need to do. You know, it's just that any of us that have been in those situations where we're said, like, I remember in one country, I think like the visa was only for 10 days. And like, I knew we were going to be there for 20. And it was like, well, what were we going to say? And they're like, no, when you go through, just say you're only going to be there for, 10 days. They won't check on the way out. And it was like, I mean, I did that just fine, but it was like, no, like that's not really how it's supposed to work. Or, yeah, there's all kinds of great stories about that, as to get into other places, what we'll do. But anyways, just a side thing to think about.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think for me, it doesn't necessarily bother me if missionaries or short-term missions, well, I guess I could see where it would bother me, but like, well, I guess let me put it this way. What bothers me more is if you're inconsistent about it. If you're going to see that sometimes there are ends that justify a means, or that the law of man sometimes needs to be trumped by a better purpose, then be consistent with that. Or if you're going to say, nope, they have to come here legally, regardless of whatever they might be fleeing from, regardless of whatever other things should be worth my compassion. If you're going to be rigid about that, then be rigid about the other thing too, I guess. Be consistent is where I guess I would. But anyways, I digress. So what are some of the reasons someone might want to come to our country? I guess there's so many misconceptions. What are some of the reasons someone might come here illegally? Because I think there's sort of this narrative that what I hear you saying is that may not be everyone's intention. Like, it may not be their intention to come here or be here illegally / undocumented. But the narrative is sort of that they are, sinning with a high hand, that they are intentionally undermining our country's good laws. And even there's another narrative that they're here for, nefarious reasons. They're here for harmful reasons. So that's sort of the narrative. From your perspective, what's the truth?
Yeah, I've yet to meet an immigrant who like wanted to be undocumented. Like, I mean, I've met thousands in my time. I think there's a group that just like you felt it was easy. And so they thought they would just come and get a job. They didn't realize there was this whole process. And I mean, especially people that came a lot of immigrants, especially undocumented immigrants, have lived here before the year 2000. So I think a lot of people that came in the 90s, the border used to be a lot more porous. And so you could come, you'd work, you'd go back home to Mexico or El Salvador, you'd work, it was just like, there's good jobs. So you just go. And then all of a sudden, I remember talking to friends who were like watching the news and thinking, oh, those people, I can't believe they're doing that. And then like realizing, oh, those people are us. I didn't, not realizing how serious things were. And so I think no one wants to be undocumented. I think people that show up at our southern border, they're seeking asylum. They're fleeing. I think we need to understand in a way that I think most people don't, that there are literally, we have, like I said, 281 million people who are immigrants, but 90 million of them are forcibly displaced. Mm. So that means like they have to leave home because of, war, violence, persecution. We have an all-time high, 27.1 million refugees in the world today. And so when we hear things like, the reality is 1.6 million encounters at our southern border in the past year, 1.6 million. That seems huge. But in the grand scope of what I just shared, 90 million forcibly displaced people, like 26, it's like, of course there's a lot of people that are trying to come. I don't think people realize that only a quarter of the people at our southern border, 30% or so, are from Mexico. Like 70% of the people at our southern border trying to come in without papers, just trying to come here, are coming because they're fleeing. And under law, you're allowed to come without papers if you want to go after asylum. And so we have an all-time high of people who are trying to come to our country saying, because of my social situation. So it's not just like my neighborhood's violence. It's like because of my race, because of my gender, because of my religion, because of my political affiliation. You have to put yourself in a social group. Because of that, I've either been persecuted or will be persecuted. And the reality is they're not coming and like trying to sneak. I think that's the issue. It's like we think like, oh, building tunnels and in the darkness of night. What's happening at our southern border are people are turning themselves in. That's why there's so many border encounters, because the first step in the process is you meet with someone, they do a credible fear interview to see, do you have the foundation to prove that you could be an asylum applicant? And literally, like, it used to be as close to 90%, but it's like well over 3/4 of the people pass credible fear. And it's like, yes, you have a genuine reason to try to be coming and seeking asylum. The sad thing is, when it comes to asylum in our country, there were 155,000 defensive. I hate that this is so complex, I know. But basically, defensive asylum means when you get to the southern border, or when you're caught and you say, I'm scared of being sent back, you're put in removal proceedings. So we're saying you can defend yourself, and if you can prove asylum, you can stay, but we're trying to send you back. So it's the opposite of like innocent until proven guilty. Like in immigration with this, it's saying, no, we are putting you in removal proceedings to send you back, but you can defend and stay by seeking asylum. So, like I said, 155,000 defensive applications, only 26% were approved. So all of those ones at the border, a trained person interviewed them and said, we think you have a vital fear, but only 1/4 of them, when they went through the process in the courts, were able to reach the bar of proving it. So that means 3/4 of them don't just get like, oh, it's cool. It's like, no, you have an order of deportation. You either get asylum or you get ordered removed. And so the reality is, I think people are coming to our country because they're having to leave their places of origin. They're genuinely afraid. A lot of times they don't reach the bar, which is a high bar for asylum. And so they're left in this really, really difficult place. And I think once people realize that, and the reality is people can reach out to me at any time. I'm easy to get a hold of. I'll have a conversation and a coffee with anyone, or meet people via Zoom and ask all their difficult questions. I think the truth is so illuminating when it comes to this. I think most people who are very against things, once they understand the truth of the situation, it's like, I had no idea. Like, I don't know about you, but I thought when people came in the southern border, it was like, and then they were released, that meant they like had papers, they were good to go. I had no idea that meant, no, they're in this long court process that's trying to remove them. And for most people, they will be removed at the end of it. Like that isn't shared in the news. What's shared in the news, oh my gosh, they're releasing all these, it's like, no, the truth is a lot more complex. And it also lets people know like how concerned I think they should be.
So you're saying the truth is more complex than the memes we share on social media?
Yeah.
So in line with that, are there a couple like, and maybe none come to mind, but are there any sort of what I would call propaganda myths or misconceptions, like the ones that you can fit into a Twitter tweet or a Facebook meme or status post? Like, are there some common rhetoric surrounding immigration that is just flat out unhelpful or not true or just misrepresenting reality?
Yeah, I think, do it the right way, or get in line like we did, not understanding that historically, the largest wave of immigration that most of our grandparents or grandparents came through, 1880 through 1920, was radically different. Like, everyone was lawfully able to work. People came like as lawful permanent residents. It was easy to become a citizen. There wasn't forms or fees and things like that. And so the reality is, and if people don't get anything, well, I want them to get when we hit the scripture things. I think that's really important. I don't really care where you fall on the spectrum. You're not following Jesus, but if you're following Jesus, I deeply think this matters, and you have a limited space on the spectrum of where to sit. But for everyone, if we could just realize, if your grandparents or great grandparents, whoever immigrated the right way and waited in the line like they were supposed to, came now, they would be undocumented. Mm-hmm. And if all the people that you are hateful towards and say come the right way came when your parents and grandparents came, rather, your great grandparents, they would be US citizens.
Yeah.
Like, let that digest for a little bit. Like, so stop doing the memes about like, it's easy, come the right way. Yes, it was. We celebrate our immigrant history and we villainize our immigrant presence. And it's like, good. It's just a different, and it's like, once I realized that I love my grandparents immigrated from Poland, Slovakia, I shared earlier, my name was changed at Ellis Island. I celebrate that. And it was hard. They changed countries. They had to learn a new language, but they waited in line for 3 to 5 hours. They were asked 20 questions and they showed up. They didn't even know where they were going. They went to the train station, heard the Slavic language, entered the train and went to Youngstown. And it's like, it's not that way anymore. And so we need to understand it. So that's one that studying immigrant history will open your eyes to some pretty glaring things that we can't capture in a meme. Immigrants steal jobs. That has been proven to be false time and time again. The reality is that in the immigrant workforce is necessary. It actually helps because the economy is an individual job siloed. It's a line, right? And so if immigrants aren't taking care of, in our state, like tomatoes in Elwood, then how are the truckers? It's like it goes up and down the line. So if you remove immigrants, I remember talking to a guy who was in charge of the dairy farms for a whole state saying, cows need milked. Like, you can't just tell them to stop, wait. Like, no, it's like, and if I don't have immigrant hands to milk cows, I don't know, how we're going to have milk. And it's like, the reality is that in most sectors where there's lots of immigrants, and by the way, we often forget immigrants work at both ends of the economic spectrum. Like, they work in many unskilled labor positions that most people don't want. They're doing very hard labor, but simultaneously, most immigrants are 2 times as likely to have a PhD as a native born. In some states, the most usual immigrant job is not a cook or someone cleaning a hotel room. It's a college professor or an engineer. Like, out of all the startup firms in the country, 1/3 of them have an immigrant on their leadership team. Like, the reality is they have a higher range of entrepreneurs and a higher range of investors. So the idea of stealing jobs is a myth. Another one is they don't pay taxes. The reality is in the 1980s, when it was in the 1980s. Up until then, if you were here, you could work lawfully. In the 1980s, they finally kind of said you have to have work authorization. Like, you have to prove you have a social security number. Right after that went into effect, the IRS created the ITIN number, the individual taxpayer identification number, because they realized people without socials were going to work and they wanted to make sure that they could still pay taxes. $16 billion a year goes into Social Security from people who are paying taxes that can never receive Social Security. Wow. That was by the Social Security actuary. That isn't like some pro-immigrant think tank. That's the Social Security Department themselves saying billions of dollars. Are there people who don't pay taxes? Yes. The vast majority do, and they're never going to get the benefits of paying into Social Security or Medicare. The final one I think is often shared is the idea that they're threats or criminals. In every comprehensive study, it's called the immigration paradox, that when immigration increases in a community, crime decreases. There is, when you look at native-born people and foreign-born people, more native-born are in prison, more native-born are convicted. And so the idea that the idea of threats or criminals are out to get us, it's like all of the studies have shown that just isn't the case, that immigrants coming into your community actually make it less of a place of crime. Because the reality is, let's be honest, most immigrants are fleeing that.
Yeah, right.
And so I think
not wanting to perpetuate it.
Yeah. They're the victims of crime, not necessarily the ones perpetuating crime. So I think most of the things we hear, and this is why you do your podcast, right? It's like, the reality is let's ask good questions. Yeah. And let's find the answers and realize that truth is truth. and it's like, it isn't found, like you said, like on a little meme or on a little Twitter thing that sounds like a great statement. It's like, there's probably something better. Like, let's ask the questions and really figure this out. And I think all of the myths get busted when you build your first relationship with an immigrant.
Mm-hmm.
Because then all of a sudden you're like, wait a second, like you're hearing these things. You're like, well, that isn't like what I know about Heriberto or Nico or like Abigail, or like you start like, you're like, I know them and they might not even have documentation, but I know them to be, good, and they're paying taxes and they own a home and they're,
Yep.
engaged in the community. And it's like, and so that's what I wish. I could never convince people. I mean, I'm grateful to be on and talking with you, but like the people listening, it's like, if they're on one side or the other, like they're either saying like, oh, this is great, or I don't know about that guy, the reality is it's relationships, it's tables, it's that changes us in our views. And so anyways.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree with that. All of the ways my paradigms have been challenged related to what I would say are people issues have started with a face-to-face conversation that challenged my preconceived ideas and, all those other things we could talk about, the biases and prejudices and all this stuff. Man, so I guess this is a little bit contentious maybe to say, but so what I hear you saying is, when a politician says that drugs and murderers are just pouring in at our southern border, at these alarming rates, rapists, and they're just, going to create these horrifically dangerous communities, and we're going to look like a third world country if we don't do something. That's not true. Like, it's just, and I'm not necessarily trying to be partisan in politics here. I'm just saying, like, when someone makes that statement, it's not founded on reality. It's founded on some propaganda that appeals to an emotion.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That I think, and there will be people listening. I mean, it's like you painting with a wide brush on either side isn't necessarily wise. Like, are there immigrant criminals? Are there immigrants in prison? Yes. But what we're saying is that the idea that the vast majority are this or that, it just isn't correct. The vast majority are victims. The vast majority are fleeing. The vast majority, own homes. Like, immigrants are more likely to own a home, or more likely, you can look at all of the real data, and it just goes against all of the kind of apparent myths where it's like you find one person who fits that narrative and you're like, look, I found him. And it's like, yeah, but what about the millions of others that, are the exact opposite? And so, yeah.
Yeah. Well, one of the things, I did a little bit of research, I forgot which website it was, but I just did a little bit on persecuted Christians. And I found that there is a fair percentage of refugees and a fair percentage that we turn away that are actually our fellow believers who are fleeing persecution.
Oh.
And so
I think most people don't realize. Yeah.
So some of the political, well, I was going to say, some of the political positions that we take, we don't realize we're inadvertently sort of setting ourselves up against other persecuted Christians if we take some of those hard line positions against some things,
Yeah. Every year, 27.1 million refugees, like you said, many of them persecuted because of their faith. Many of them have faith in Jesus. Every year we have a ceiling. We'll only accept up to this amount. And I understand that you can't accept them all.
Yeah.
But, the ceiling used to be around like 80,000, 150,000.
It was dropped to something like 17.
Yeah, 15. Yeah. And they only that year brought in like 9. And so it's like, and
crazy.
Yet I think what we do is we pat ourselves on the back. And so the other myth that often gets perpetuated by even church folks I hear is like, we can't help everyone. And
we can help more, though.
It's like, I understand, yet, it's like there are countries that have nowhere near what we have, who are doing far more than we're doing. And yet we want to focus on good job, pat ourselves in the back for the little bit we're doing, not saying and then once again, if you're not a Jesus follower, it's like, I understand. But if you are, it's like, we really have to look, to the rabbi and say, like, well, what would Jesus call us to do in this situation? Like, would he be okay saying, like, can't help ever? It's like, and then he tells us the Good Samaritan. So, it's like, and then he talks about like what it means to like actually, serve the vulnerable and care for the least of these. And then it's like, oh, wait a second. I actually think we as the church are really called to do this.
Yeah. So, I mean, I feel like that leads right into the next question of, so what unique perspective, and I guess from your perspective, does a Jesus follower, a Christian, what unique perspective do we bring to the table, or should we bring to the table, if we're rooted in the way of Jesus and Scripture?
So this, this is the most important one, right? If you're a person of faith listening, the reality is the Bible from Genesis to Revelation speaks very clearly about immigrants. And I have to be honest, I was blind to it up until, just recently. The reality is, God only calls people in the Old Testament to love. He says, love me, love with their heart, soul, mind, and strength. It says, love your neighbor as yourself. And then he says, love the foreigner living among you. And then the question is, well, why? And he says, because I do, follow my lead. Like over 30 times in the Old Testament, there's clear instructions to love immigrants, and it's tangible. Immigrants, it was codified in the law. They should be paid a fair wage. If you read the passage in Ruth, you all understand about how gleaning worked, that it's like, you don't pick up the leftover crops. You don't harvest the corners. That was for immigrants. But so people like, oh, I remember hearing about that. Okay, here is like, for me, just the mic drop. The quartet of the vulnerable is throughout the Old Testament, especially in the prophets.
Yeah, I love that you're going to
specifically cares, the poor, the widow, the orphan, and the immigrant. But here's what's crazy. In the ancient Near East, the triad, the poor, the widow, and the orphan, is called to be cared for by any like good and moral culture and king. It is uniquely the immigrants that Yahweh says, hey, this is going to be a group that, naturally speaking, as humans, like, because of all, like, we are going to look at immigrants. This is an American issue. This is all times, all places, all cultures. Yeah. We will look at the other as a burden or a threat. And yet my people will have this radical countercultural ideal that you will also love and care for immigrants. I think this is why in the New Testament, any list of what an elder or church leader, any list of a pastor, there is that word hospitality, which in English and in church culture in America, we have dumbed down to mean you're an extrovert who hosts a Super Bowl party. Keep doing that. That's wonderful. But literally that characteristic is philoxenos, philo, love, xenos, immigrants. It isn't loving strangers. Xenos is foreigner. It is immigrants. And so the reason why I think church leaders are called to have this it's like the only explanation is Jesus. I can't tell you how many times people come because of what I do. They see my last name, and I think a lot of times we've had it with Africans, we've had it with Latinos, we've had it with all they see Szmara, and so they expect that I don't look like you're not seeing me now, but I am a middle-aged white man. And so they'll be like, where's Pastor Zach? And I'm like, I'm right here. And they're like, no, you're not. And I'm like, I think I know who I am. But it's so confusing because why would someone like me be known for what I do? And it's like, I can't tell you the times I get to share. This is the radicalness of the gospel at work. This is what God calls us to, not to lower the ball, but to raise it. Only the Holy Spirit working inside you can develop a characteristic where when you see immigrants, it's not threats or burdens. It's like, no, love, welcome, celebrate. And like, I think, it's just the pages of scripture speak so directly to it. Okay, then the final one, Matthew 25:35, right? It's the separation of the sheep and the goats, if you remember. And what we have done in modern day America is make that about acts of charity. Yeah. So we can listen to the separation and say, well, I gave money, and I visited this person in jail, and I went to the food pantry and gave cans. Okay, so the Greek says that at the end of the age, he's gathering ethnos. That means he's gathering communities. This isn't about individual. Yep. This is about saying as peoples, as systems, how well do we welcome? Yeah. It's like, and I don't know what that means. Like, I don't know if that means your family unit. I don't know if that means your church, your neighborhood, your community, your city, the country. But for whatever reason, like the scripture clear, it's like, how are your systems? How well do I as a family, how well do I as a church, are we known by saying, when immigrants come to our community, this is how we lead? We lead with love and welcome. We're the first people to say, we want you here. We celebrate you. Like, we want to get to know you. Or are we people who, aren't the best, at welcoming? It's like, what does that look like? I think it's pretty profound. And I said it final, but I actually have one more that's been big for me. In Acts chapter 8, we get our first, after the resurrection, we get our first encounter of an immigrant and a native born. So it's Philip, an Ethiopian eunuch. Yeah. And what I love about that story, and I teach all the time, is Philip had to be called twice. He was called first to proximity. He shared geographic space with an immigrant. The reality is, anyone listening to this podcast, I guarantee in your community, you share geographic proximity to immigrants. But may I remind you that Philip was called a second time to kalao with that immigrant. Kalao is the root word for glue. It's like stick like glue, connect, join together. I often use Legos as an illustration. Legos in a box, they could be all different colors, shapes, and sizes, but they're nothing unless they're connected together. And so the question becomes, you are in proximity to immigrants. And if you are a follower of Jesus, if you are a person of faith, you are called to be more than proximate. You are called to connect with, to journey with, to welcome, to love, and not just in feelings. I mean, it's tangible expressions of saying, how do I do this, in my community? And so, I deeply care about this because, as a pastor and a person of faith, I don't think this is one of those things. I always thought, 10, 20, 30 years ago, I thought this was who does Jesus root for during the NFL season? It's that's not in the Bible. It's that's choose for yourself. And there's a lot of issues like that aren't specifically in the Bible. This isn't one of them. God speaks very clearly to this one. And then, the pushback, like you said, you already brought it up, as Romans, respecting governing authorities. May I remind you that there is nothing unlawful about loving and welcoming immigrants, regardless of their status. The immigrants that don't have status, they have to wrestle with that. How do I live my life in a way that is honoring to God, knowing, and I know a lot of believers who are undocumented that struggle with this. I want to be right and I don't know how, and does this mean leaving my family? How do I reconcile this? But if you're not in that position, there is no confusion. It's we are called to love and welcome and care for, and not say can I see your papers first? It's that's not how that works. And it's not how it works with anyone else, by the way. Why is it that in the church today, when the drug dealer comes to faith, we celebrate it, and we can forgive whatever he or she has done. There's lots of people who are addicts, and it's case in point, in my community, I host Narcotics Anonymous meetings in my church, and I'm celebrated for it. And they're all convicts and felons, and yet what I do with immigrants is always questioned. And in immigration law, that's the same as getting a parking ticket. It's not criminal law that immigration is in. And so we've elevated this one thing. It's how dare you help those people? But then these people, it's of course you should love and care. It's may I help you balance and say, as a follower of Jesus, we are called specifically, to love and welcome, others and meet them where they are and journey with them. And when that happens, just like you shared earlier, it's powerful. The face-to-face connection, the meeting around a table, the sharing food, the journeying together will radically change your life. I'm more like Jesus because of the immigrants in my life, by far. They have discipled me and been instruments of God's work in my life, probably more than anything else. Man,
I am so just with you, checking with you on it's just, I'm borderline have this anger inside of me. There's all these, especially the way I put it sometimes is these people issues have been reduced to political issues, and they're much more complicated than that, but also they're people and they're human beings. And the way some of our political talking points talk about them is so counter scripture, so counter the Bible. And it's so troubling to me. And like you, I didn't realize how much scripture talked about it. But if you read through, I mean, the major and minor prophets, it's just concern for the poor, the oppressed, the orphan, the widow, the foreigner, the stranger among you, like all these words, these people just over and over show up. And it's not just New Testament. It's not just Jesus, give a cup of that Matthew 25, give a cup of cold water. You clothe them. When I was in prison, you visited me. And whatever you did to the least of these, you did to me. It's not just Jesus. Like it's a theme, like you said, from Genesis to Revelation. And it's like, how, sometimes like, how have we missed this? How have we missed it? So, to me, sometimes it's such a glaring, fault in the church right now. Like that sounds strong, but like it is, and it's not true of, I want to be clear, it's not true of everybody. It's not true of everybody in our churches. Some people just don't know, but there is a decent amount of people who've just sort of went along with those talking points we talked about earlier that are sort of the myths or misconceptions, and we've not really questioned them. And then, like you said, sometimes, like what you just said, that your work with the addicts is celebrated, but it troubles me that you said sometimes people will question what you're doing with immigrants. That right there tells me that there is something wrong. There's something wrong here. There's a Jarrett, we talked a little bit about pastor we know. He talked about this SNR. Something's not right. When it comes to immigration in the church, I feel like there's an SNR. There's something not right, largely. That's really critical. I don't mean to be critical. Everything you're sharing is just so...
At Immigrant Connection, we have a phrase that immigration is an issue, but immigrants are people, and you just kind of said it yourself. I think that's key for the church to realize. Often we have opinions on issues with relationships with the people. Like, even with what's happening in our country right now, like the reality is like you can have all kinds of opinions and thoughts on issues, but it's like, at least when we see Jesus and his ministry, it was all about connection with people. And it's like, I'm trying to avoid, because I saw what I did with immigration in my past, where I didn't have any relationship with immigrants, but boy, could I talk.
Yeah.
They didn't do it the right way, this and that and that. And that's like, I think as the church, once again, if you're not following Jesus, like you have a wider spectrum. For us, it's narrower. It's like, before I start spouting off about this or that issue, like, how am I in relationship? How am I proximate? How am I listening and learning from the actual people that are in the midst of it? And that's hard because, right, we want to avoid some areas at all costs.
Mm-hmm.
We want to bypass them. And immigrants are one of our Samarias. The poor is one of our Samarias. Mental health is one of our Samarias. We have lots of things in the United States, especially, that we want to talk about, but kind of avoid the people because they make us, uncomfortable. And it seems to me that those are the exact. I think that's why John 4:1, Jesus had to go to Samaria. No, he didn't. Every good Jew went on the other side of the river and went the roundabout way. But for him, it's like, no, like if we're going to talk about Samaria, we're going to talk to Samaritans. And so I have to go where Samaritans are. And I think it's powerful. It's hard though. Like I often share, when I share kind of my personal story, like I loved serving in Jerusalem, Judea, and I was championed in the far parts, like, to go to the ends of the earth. But most of us do have a void in our ministry resume of like, what is my Samaria? And I'll tell people often now, my immigrants are not my Samaria. They're very much my Jerusalem. And so God has pushed me, like even starting in Narcotics Anonymous, I was very uncomfortable with. It was like, God, no. And it's like, no matter, like, whenever you're Samaria, you become comfortable with, it's like, there's another one, believe me. And so some people listening that have been nodding the whole time, like, yes, I love immigrants. It's like, I would probably challenge you to think like, okay, immigrants are now your Jerusalem, but who are the people in your community that you would say fall into that category? And how do we follow Jesus there? Because at least for me, I've learned anytime it's like I get comfortable, it's like there's another place he's pushing me to say, yeah, but you've turned a blind eye to these, my beloved people, for so long. Not anymore, Zach. You need to start doing so.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so good, man. This is such a complicated issue, and we've talked for so long. But I have
sorry.
No, I just.
Do you have an editor? Do you edit these?
Well, kind of, but I think we'll mostly retain most of this. I do have. Maybe you can't answer this, and then I'm going to ask the last, sort of lump the last couple together. But the thing about the 1965, I think you said, when it changed and it got much more complex with the forms and the costs, like, why did that change? Do you know, like, what?
Well, it was bad before that too. So before the Hart-Celler Act, we were on the national origins formula. So there's two big things. So, like, the 1920s, we were scared of the diversity that was happening in our country. So we made immigration about you can only come. We based it on the census from 1890. So basically we said 30 years ago, we liked the different ethnicities here. We don't like the ethnicities here now. How do we change it? This is when America, I don't think people realize this, but we created white. Whole other podcast for you. But the reality is white did not exist. Immigration created white. We decided what we felt were the good, like Italians were not considered white. It's like we made the determination. So there was the national origins formula that was very based on where you were from. In 1965, we decided that doesn't seem right. It shouldn't matter where you're from. What if what we cared about with immigration is, are you able to take a good job, and do you already have family here? So in 1965, we switched immigration to be about categories based on if you're related to people and what your job might be. And literally, if you think about it, what else has lasted since 1965? We've updated everything because the context changes. We've updated our tax laws innumerable times. But that is basically, it is. That's the Immigration and Nationality Act that we basically work for. And it was just a change in saying it shouldn't have to say, oh, I'm from, if you're from Africa, there's not a space for you. Or if you're from, China, you're excluded. We wanted to write that. And so how we did it was by saying, there has to be some reasoning. And so we made it about families and employment and put those caps on it. And then we kind of left it there. And so that's why it got complex. And then it wasn't actually until the 80s. In the 80s, after Reagan opened up a pathway for more people they call it the amnesty, but it really wasn't. But regardless, he opened up this pathway for a lot more people to get lawful permanent residency. It was at that point that they said, who should pay for all of this? The people who are using it. And I don't think people realize that. You don't pay for the post office. Tax dollars, your stamps don't. But immigration is paid for. 96% of their budget is paid for by the form fees collected. And so naturalization in 1994 used to be $70. Now it's $725. And the previous administration wanted to make it $1,300. So it's the reality is everyone that complains about immigration, it's not costing you anything. Immigrants have to keep paying more and more and more money because it's codified that their fees have to be able to foot the bill. And so that was something more recent than 1965. It was when they started adding, more forms and things. Even the current citizenship didn't even exist since 2008. I think a lot of things with immigration, like I said, that history and presence, we don't realize how new some of the very difficult pieces of our process are. So.
Yeah, man, it's crazy. Well, just to wrap this up, I guess, even though I feel like we could do a whole other episode, just continuing to talk and tease this out. I think the most important thing was just your brief highlights of the scriptural sort of, I would say mandates, the scriptural mandates. But so let's say someone, the everyday Jesus follower, how could we love our immigrant neighbor more fully, and or how could we get involved in you said you're not an advocacy group, but are there things we could do to say, okay, this system is broken, and what can we do? I guess that's a really broad question, but what can the everyday Jesus follower What can we do?
Yeah, so we get that question so much that we created a free devotional we give away. And it's if you go to icwelcome.org and you go to the Get Involved page, it's right there. You can request hard copies, but it's just right there digitally. And we literally have like 2 pages of like a whole list of practical things, like how to welcome your neighbor, like as easy as like, initiating a conversation with newcomers, ask about their home country and culture, organize welcome walks, be a go-to person for immigrants if they need questions, accompany immigrant parents to school events, sharing with them where to get, the good quality food, helping with housing. Like there's a whole, like everything from something very, very simple, as easy as like when someone comes to the neighborhood, give a small gift, like knock and introduce yourself, to as complex as, starting a conversational English program. And we have toolkits to do that for free. So I would encourage people not to just push. I mean, there's lots of other great resources out there, but we tried to say this is a very doable, it's like a 5-session devotional that just focuses on what scripture says and then some very practical things. And even for like next steps, it's like everyone learns differently because God created us all different. So if you learn through books, we have a list of books you could read. If you like podcasts, we have podcasts, movies you can watch. I think all the streaming services, like even if you have little kids, Disney Plus just did a recent, like there's not even words in it, but it's a Pixar short that talks about the immigration journey. A Korean did it, a filmmaker. And so we have all different, like whether you want to, there's sermons, there's a list of sermons you could watch or listen to. And so basically that's kind of a great resource. If you go to the website, you can grab it, that we try to package everything together to make it easy. We call it the welcome journey. We think everyone has to take their first or next step on the welcome journey. And so even if you're someone who's been doing this for a while, I think you'll find great resources there. But if you're just starting, you'll also find great resources related to how do I get started with this?
So I think that leads into the other question. How you mentioned it, but go ahead and mention it real quick again. The Immigrant Connection. So, how can we find out more about it? All that stuff.
Yep. So icwelcome.org, I like immigrant, C like connection, welcome.org would be our national organization. What we do is we help churches go through the government process of starting an immigration legal service site. And so we are the largest and fastest growing church-based network in the country. And we have been for a while now. We have 20 legal offices around the country. We have another 8 waiting on government approval, another 6 churches that are in the process. We basically work with 10 to 12 churches a year around the country to help open legal offices in their churches. What's amazing about this is we invest, it's about $30,000 to launch a site. My organization that we founded, we invest $25,000 if the church will invest $5,000, because we want to do whatever we can to help churches do this. We also, if a church is listening and thinking about it, these are sustainable. So unlike other outreach programs you do, there are low-cost fees. We charge about 10% of what an attorney would charge in our offices. If you can't afford that, we give away services for free. We never tell people that they can't be served if they can't afford it. But our services are, a few $100s instead of a few $1,000s. But because of that, you're generating revenue that actually is able to pay the staff and keep the office running. And so our goal is to not only help you launch a site, it's to help you become a sustainable site, so that like most of the churches that do this, I got to be honest, I mean, we're in some like large churches that are, the definition of a mega church, but the first church that did it had less than 25 people in it. It was my church that didn't have a paid pastor. It's like we can do this, whatever excuse you might have saying, oh, our church is too small of a community, doesn't have, it's like, Jesus already wiped out your excuses by letting us go first. Like it is possible and it makes a difference. The second website I'll share with you real quick is IC Legal. Once again, I as an immigrant, C as in connection, legal.org. That one's more if you know immigrants who need our services. IC Welcome is to learn about the organization and how we get started, how we help. But if you're like, where is my local office? Like I have an immigrant friend who lives in Texas, who needs answers. If you go to iclegal.org, all of our local sites, their contact information, how to get a hold of them are there. And we'd love to connect with you. And the reality is again, if you're listening, we're spread out all over the place. We'd love to be in your community, but if we're not, find your closest Immigrant Connection site and still reach out to them. A lot of them can do appointments via Zoom or even just answer some basic questions just to make sure that people have truthful answers in the midst of a confusing journey. So icwelcome.org, iclegal.org. Feel free to reach out and we can answer your questions.
Man, Zach, thank you so much. This has been, it's been an enlightening conversation. I think I had the foundational compassion, justice, scriptural convictions, but there's so much I learned about the process, the complexity of it. I also knew it was more complex than I knew, but I didn't know what I didn't know. And this has just been really enlightening for me, and I appreciate it so much. Yeah, Zach, it was good talking to you. Good to meet you via Zoom. And we hope that this encouraged you as a listener. I want to encourage you, especially with this one. I can be bad at self-promotion, but like and share, even rate and review on Apple Podcasts, and all of those things can help increase our listener base. But yeah, thank you for joining us. We'll talk to you next time.